The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, the kind of slow, relentless drizzle that turned the world gray and made people forget the sun had ever existed. It pooled in the parking lot of the Golden Fork Diner, filling potholes and running in streams toward the storm drains that couldn't keep up. Inside, the windows had fogged over, and the air smelled like coffee and wet pavement and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from working a double shift on a weekday afternoon. Carmen Reyes had been on her feet since 6 in the morning. She was 26 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that were starting to develop the permanent tiredness of someone who worked too much and slept too little. She'd been at the Golden Fork for 3 years now, ever since she'd dropped out of community college to help her mother with the bills after her father's accident left him unable to work. 3 years of breakfast rushes and lunch crowds and dinner shifts that stretched into the night. 3 years of smiling at customers who didn't tip and managers who didn't care. 3 years of telling herself this was temporary, while watching temporary stretch into something that looked a lot like permanent. The diner was half empty by 4 o'clock. The lull between lunch and dinner, when the only customers were stragglers and travelers and people who had nowhere else to be. Carmen was wiping down tables near the window when the bell above the door chimed and a man walked in. He was soaked. Water dripped from his leather jacket and pooled on the floor beneath his boots. His gray hair was plastered to his skull, and his beard, neatly trimmed but currently bedraggled, clung to his jaw like wet moss. He moved slowly, carefully, the way people move when they're cold down to their bones, and every step costs something. Carmen watched him look around the diner, his eyes finding the empty booths, the bored cook visible through the kitchen window, the manager's office door that was closed as usual. He didn't seem dangerous, he seemed tired and cold and alone in a way that made Carmen's chest ache without quite knowing why. He chose a booth near the back, sliding in with a wince that suggested stiff joints or maybe something worse. By the time Carmen reached him with a menu and a glass of water, he had his hands flat on the table, trembling slightly. Whether from cold or fatigue, she couldn't tell. "Afternoon," she said, setting down the menu. "Can I start you off with some coffee?" "Please." His voice was rough, scraped thin. "Hot as you got it." She brought him a cup and watched him wrap both hands around it like it was the only warm thing left in the world. He didn't open the menu. He just sat there, hunched over the coffee, steam rising around his face, his eyes half closed. "You okay, sir?" The question came out before she could stop it. It wasn't professional. Tony, the manager, had told her 100 times not to get personal with customers, but she couldn't help it. Something about this man pulled at her. He looked up, and she saw his eyes clearly for the first time, gray like the rain, tired like the day. But there was something else there, too, a steadiness, a depth, the kind of look that came from a life lived hard, but not without purpose. "Been better," he said. "Been worse, too. Just need to warm up, wait out the rain." Carmen nodded and left him alone. She had other tables to tend, other customers to serve, the endless cycle of orders and refills and checks that made up her days. But she found herself glancing back at the man in the booth, watching him sit motionless over his coffee, watching the steam thin and disappear as the cup grew cold. Half an hour passed. The man didn't order food. He didn't ask for a refill. He just sat there, staring at nothing, his hands still wrapped around the empty cup. Carmen watched him reach for his wallet, open it, and stare at the contents with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone counting what they had and knowing it wasn't enough. She'd worn that expression herself plenty of times. At the grocery store, deciding between bread and milk. At the pharmacy, calculating whether she could afford her mother's medication this month. At the end of every shift, adding up tips that never quite covered the bills. The man closed his wallet and set it on the table. He didn't wave her over. He didn't ask for the check. He just sat there, and Carmen understood. He'd come in for warmth, not food, because warmth was all he could afford. She made a decision. The kitchen was quiet, the cook scrolling through his phone while the grill cooled between rushes. Carmen grabbed a plate and loaded it herself. A burger, fries, a side of coleslaw from the container in the walk-in. She added a bowl of soup, the chicken noodle they made fresh every morning, and set the whole thing on a tray. "What are you doing?" The cook, a heavy-set man named Eddie, looked up from his phone. "That's not on any ticket." "I know." Carmen didn't slow down. "It's on me." She carried the tray to the man's booth and set it down in front of him. He looked at the food, then at her, confusion flickering across his weathered face. "I didn't order this." "I know." Carmen refilled his coffee from the pot she'd brought. "Consider it a gift. You look like you could use a hot meal." "Ma'am, I can't pay for this." "I didn't ask you to." She smiled, the kind of smile that cost nothing and meant everything. "Just eat. Warm up. The rain's supposed to stop by tonight." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, the hard shell of a man who'd learned not to expect kindness, cracking open, just a little, to let the light in. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough. "I don't know how to—" "You don't have to know. Just eat." She walked away before he could say anything else, before the emotion building in her chest could spill over into something unprofessional. She had tables to clear and customers to serve and a shift that wouldn't end for another 4 hours. She couldn't afford to stand around getting sentimental, but she couldn't help glancing back, watching the man pick up the spoon and start on the soup, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since he'd walked through the door. She didn't see Tony step out of his office. She didn't see him watch her set down the plate, didn't see him observe the exchange, didn't see the expression that settled on his face, the cold, calculating look of a man who valued profit over people and had never understood why anyone would choose differently. What she saw, 10 minutes later, was Tony standing at the end of her section, with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. "Carmen, my office, now." The office was small and cluttered, the walls covered with health inspection certificates and employee schedules, and a motivational poster that said, "Excellence is not an act, but a habit." Tony sat behind his desk, a man in his early 40s with thinning hair and a permanent expression of disapproval. He'd owned the Golden Fork for 5 years, inherited it from his father-in-law, and ran it the way some people ran prisons, with rules, punishments, and the assumption that everyone was trying to steal from him. "You want to explain what I just saw?" he asked. Carmen stood in front of the desk, her hands clasped behind her back. "A customer needed help. I helped him." "You gave away food, my food, without authorization, without payment, without even asking." "He was hungry, Tony. He was cold and tired, and he didn't have money for a meal. You couldn't just do your job?" Tony leaned forward. "You couldn't just follow the rules, the same rules everyone else follows? We have policies, Carmen. We have procedures. If every waitress started giving away food to every sad story that walked through the door, I'd be out of business in a month. It was one meal. I was going to pay for it out of my tips." "That's not the point." Tony's voice hardened. "The point is, you made a decision without consulting me. You undermined my authority. You showed every other employee that rules don't matter if you feel sorry for someone." Carmen felt the anger rising in her chest, hot and sharp. He was a person, Tony, a human being who needed help. That should matter more than a $10 plate of food. Nothing matters more than the bottom line. That's something you've never understood. Tony stood, and his face was cold. "You're fired, Carmen. Effective immediately. Turn in your apron, collect your things, and get out." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Tony, please. I've been here 3 years. I've never missed a shift, never called in sick, never. And now you've stolen from me. That's how I see it, and that's how any court would see it if you try to fight this." He pointed at the door. "Out, now." Carmen stood frozen, her mind racing. 3 years. 3 years of her life, gone in 10 minutes, because she'd given a hungry man a meal. She thought about her mother, about the bills, about the rent that was due in 2 weeks. She thought about the job applications she'd have to fill out, the interviews she'd have to endure, the weeks or months it might take to find something else. She thought about the man in the booth, eating his soup, not knowing what his meal had cost her. "Fine," she said. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking. "I'll go." She walked out of the office, untied her apron, and set it on the counter. Eddie watched her from the kitchen, his face pale. The other waitress on duty, a girl named Kelsey who'd only been there 6 months, looked away, afraid of catching whatever Carmen had. Carmen collected her things from the break room, her jacket, her purse, the photograph of her parents she kept in her locker. She walked back through the diner, past the tables she'd served for 3 years, past the window where the rain was still falling, past the booth where the man sat finishing his meal. He looked up as she passed. Their eyes met, and something in his expression shifted, recognition, maybe, or concern. "Everything okay?" he asked. Carmen stopped. She looked at him, this stranger she'd fed, this man who had cost her everything without meaning to, and she made another decision. She wouldn't burden him with her problems. She wouldn't make him feel guilty for something that wasn't his fault. She would walk out of this diner with her head high and figure out the rest later. "Everything's fine," she said. "Enjoy your meal." She pushed through the door and stepped into the rain. Behind her, the man called Shepard watched her go. He watched the door swing shut, watched her figure disappear into the gray afternoon, watched the rain swallow her whole. And then he looked at the plate of food in front of him and the coffee she'd refilled without being asked, and he understood. He'd been around long enough to recognize sacrifice when he saw it. He finished his meal slowly, thinking. When he was done, he left a 20 on the table, all the cash he had, and walked to the counter where a nervous young waitress was pretending to organize receipts. "The woman who served me," he said. "The one who just left. What happened?" Kelsey glanced toward the manager's office, her face tight with fear. I'm not supposed to. Please." His voice was gentle but firm. "I need to know." Kelsey hesitated. Then, in a whisper so low he had to lean in to hear it, "Tony fired her for giving you that food. He said she was stealing." Shepard nodded slowly. He looked at the office door, at the man visible through the small window sitting at his desk with a satisfied expression. "Thank you," Shepard said. "You've been very helpful." He walked out into the rain, climbed onto his motorcycle, and rode away. But he didn't go far. He found a gas station a mile down the road, pulled under the awning, and made a phone call. The conversation was short, the instructions were clear, and 48 hours later, the entire Iron Horseman Motorcycle Club would walk through the doors of the Golden Fork Diner. But Tony didn't know that yet. He was still sitting in his office, congratulating himself on maintaining discipline. He had no idea what was coming. Carmen spent the first night on her mother's couch, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about what came next. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that doubled as a living room, and it had been crowded even before Carmen had moved back in after her father's accident. Now, with her parents in one room and her younger brother Diego in the other, the couch was the only option. She'd slept there before, during the worst of her father's recovery, and she'd told herself then that it was temporary. That word again, temporary. Her mother, Rosa, had taken the news of the firing with the quiet stoicism she applied to everything, the accident, the bills, the slow erosion of the life they'd built. She'd made Carmen tea, patted her hand, and told her that God had a plan. Carmen wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that somewhere in the universe there was a reason for all of this, a purpose she couldn't see. But at 2 a.m, lying on a couch that smelled like her father's cigars and her brother's dirty socks, Faith felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She got up at dawn, before anyone else was awake, and started making calls. The job market was brutal. She'd known that in an abstract way, had seen the news stories, heard the statistics, but knowing it and living it were different things. Every restaurant in town was either fully staffed or not hiring. The few that agreed to interview her wanted references, and Carmen knew that Tony would poison any reference he gave. He was that kind of man, petty, vindictive, the kind who couldn't stand to lose, even when he'd already won. By Thursday afternoon, she'd applied to 14 places and heard back from none. Her savings, what little she had, would cover maybe 2 weeks of groceries if she stretched them. After that, she didn't know. She couldn't ask her parents for money. They had none to give. She couldn't ask Diego. He was 17 and still in high school, working part-time at a car wash for minimum wage. She was supposed to be the one who held things together, the responsible one, the one who made sure the rent got paid and the lights stayed on. And now she was sitting in a coffee shop she couldn't afford, nursing a cup she'd paid for with quarters, wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Telemarketers probably, or scammers, or one of the dozen creditors who had her number and called at all hours. But something made her swipe the screen and lift the phone to her ear. "Hello. Is this Carmen Reyes?" The voice was male, older, with a roughness she almost recognized. "Who's asking?" "My name is Shepard. You served me at the Golden Fork 2 days ago. You gave me a meal when I couldn't pay for one." Carmen's breath caught. She remembered him, the rain-soaked man with the gray eyes, the one who'd wrapped his hands around a coffee cup like it was the only warm thing left in the world. the one who'd cost her her job. "I remember," she said carefully. "How did you get this number?" "I have resources." A pause. "I also have information. I heard what happened after I left, that you were fired for helping me." Carmen closed her eyes. "It's not your fault. You didn't ask me to do it." "No, but you did it anyway, and you lost your job because of it." Another pause, longer this time. "I'd like to make that right if you'll let me." "Make it right how?" "Come to the Golden Fork on Saturday, around noon. There's something I'd like you to see." Carmen frowned. "I can't go back there. Tony made it clear." "Tony won't be a problem, not after Saturday." The voice carried a weight that made Carmen's skin prickle. "Trust me, Carmen. You're going to want to be there." The line went dead. Carmen sat in the coffee shop for a long time, staring at her phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A stranger she'd fed once was calling her, asking her to return to the place she'd been fired from, promising that her former boss wouldn't be a problem. It sounded crazy. It sounded like the setup for something dangerous or illegal or both. But something in his voice, that steadiness, that quiet certainty, made her want to believe him, made her want to trust that this wasn't just another door closing, but something else entirely. She went home and didn't tell anyone about the call. Friday passed in a blur of job applications and rejection emails and the slow, grinding anxiety of not knowing what came next. Carmen helped her mother with dinner, played video games with Diego, sat with her father while he watched the evening news and complained about his physical therapy. She went through the motions of a normal life while her mind circled endlessly around the phone call and the stranger's promise. Saturday morning, she woke before dawn and couldn't get back to sleep. She showered, dressed, and told her mother she was going out to run errands. Rosa looked at her with the knowing eyes of a woman who had raised 3 children and could spot a lie from across the room, but she didn't press. She just kissed Carmen's cheek and told her to be careful. Carmen drove to the Golden Fork and parked across the street, in the lot of a hardware store that had gone out of business 6 months ago. From there, she could see the diner's entrance, the parking lot, the sad little sign that flickered even in daylight. It was 11:30. The lunch rush would be starting soon, and she could see Kelsey through the window, moving between tables with the harried efficiency of someone working understaffed. She waited. At 11:45, she heard the engines. It started as a distant rumble, the kind of sound that could be mistaken for thunder or a passing truck. But it grew, swelling like a wave, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with it. Carmen leaned forward in her seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road that led to the diner. They came around the corner in formation, motorcycles, dozens of them, then dozens more. They poured into the parking lot like a flood, chrome and black leather gleaming in the pale autumn sun. They filled every space, lined up along the curb, spilled onto the grass at the edge of the property. The engines roared in a chorus that rattled the windows of Carmen's car, and then, all at once, they stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Carmen counted without meaning to. 50, 70, 100. More than 100 motorcycles, more than 100 riders, all of them dismounting and removing helmets and gathering in the parking lot of the Golden Fork Diner like an army assembling for battle. At the front of the formation, one man stood apart from the rest. Gray beard, weathered face, eyes like slate. Shepard. He looked across the street directly at Carmen's car and raised a hand. She got out without thinking, her legs carrying her across the pavement before her mind could catch up. The crowd of bikers parted as she approached, creating a path that led straight to Shepard. She walked it in a daze, aware of the eyes on her, aware of the silence, aware of everything and nothing at the same time. "You came," Shepard said. "You asked me to." Carmen looked at the riders, at the motorcycles, at the diner where she'd spent 3 years of her life. "What is all this?" "Justice!" Shepard turned toward the diner, and his voice carried across the crowd. "These are my brothers. Iron horsemen from 6 chapters across 4 states. They came because I told them what you did for me. They came because that kind of kindness deserves to be honored, not punished." He started walking toward the diner entrance, and the crowd moved with him, a river of leather and chrome flowing toward the glass doors. Carmen followed, pulled along by the current, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The bell above the door chimed as Shepard pushed it open. Inside, the diner had frozen. Customers sat motionless over their plates. Kelsey stood behind the counter, a coffee pot in her hand, her face pale. Eddie had emerged from the kitchen, his apron stained with grease, his expression caught between confusion and fear. And in the doorway of his office, Tony stood watching, his face the color of old paper. Shepard walked to the center of the room and stopped. The other bikers filed in behind him, filling every booth, lining every wall, until the Golden Fork was packed with more customers than it had ever held in its history. "Mr. Tony," Shepard said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Tony's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. He looked like a man who had woken up in a nightmare and couldn't figure out how to escape. His eyes darted from Shepard to the bikers to the door, calculating odds that had already been calculated for him. "I don't know what this is about," he said, his voice pitched higher than usual. "But you can't just come in here and... Can't we?" Shepard took a step forward and Tony took a step back. "Seems like we already did. Seems like we're here, 112 of us, ready to order lunch." He paused. "You do serve lunch, don't you?" Tony's jaw worked. "Of course we serve lunch, but this is... You can't... We can." Shepard turned to the nearest booth, where 3 bikers had already settled in. "What are you boys having?" "Burgers," one of them said. 3 burgers, 3 fries, 3 Cokes. You hear that?" Shepard looked at Tony. 3 burgers, 3 fries, 3 Cokes. That's paying customers, Mr. Tony. The kind you like." He gestured to the room. "And there's 109 more where that came from. All hungry, all paying, all very interested in the service at this establishment." Tony's face shifted from pale to flushed, confusion giving way to something that looked like hope. 112 customers. Even if they only ordered the cheapest items on the menu, that was more business than the Golden Fork saw in a week. His eyes flickered with the calculation, the dollar signs adding up behind his pupils. "Well," he said, straightening his tie with trembling fingers, "I suppose if you're here to eat..." "We're here to eat," Shepard confirmed, "but we're also here to talk. About what happened on Thursday, about a waitress named Carmen who lost her job for showing kindness to a stranger." The hope in Tony's face curdled. "That's none of your business. You made it my business when you fired her for feeding me." Shepard's voice hardened, the easy charm dropping away to reveal something colder underneath. "I was that stranger, Mr. Tony. I was the man she helped, and I don't take kindly to people being punished for doing the right thing." Tony's eyes found Carmen standing near the door, and his expression twisted into something ugly. You brought them here. This is harassment. This is... I'll call the police." "Go ahead." Shepard didn't move. "Call them. Tell them 100 paying customers showed up at your diner and you want them removed. See how that goes." The standoff stretched, seconds ticking by like hours. The diner was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sizzle of something forgotten on the grill. Every eye was fixed on Tony, waiting to see what he would do. He didn't call the police. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice deflated. Shepard reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He crossed the room and set it on the counter, smoothing it flat with one calloused hand. "This is a letter of apology," he said. "You're going to sign it. It says you wrongfully terminated Carmen Reyes, that she was an exemplary employee, and that you regret your decision. It also says you're offering her job back, with a raise, effective immediately." Tony laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You're insane. I'm not signing that." "Then we have a problem." Shepard leaned against the counter, casual as a man discussing the weather. "See, my brothers and I have a lot of friends who like to eat out, friends who leave reviews online, friends who talk to health inspectors and licensing boards and anyone else who might be interested in how a business treats its employees." He paused. "We also have friends who are lawyers, good ones, the kind who take wrongful termination cases on contingency and don't stop until they've bled a business dry." Tony's face went from flushed to ashen. "You're threatening me. I'm informing you of your options." Shepard straightened. "Option 1, you sign the letter, you give Carmen her job back, and we all have a nice lunch. We pay full price, we tip generously, and we leave you with a story to tell your grandkids. Option 2, you refuse, and we make it our mission to ensure that every person in a 50-mile radius knows exactly what kind of man runs this establishment. We leave reviews, we file complaints, we show up every Saturday for the next year and order nothing but coffee. Your choice." The diner held its breath. Carmen watched Tony from across the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She should say something, she knew. should step in, should stop this before it went too far. But she couldn't move. She couldn't look away from the man who had fired her, who had called her a thief, who had thrown away 3 years of loyalty because she'd fed a hungry stranger. She wanted to see him squirm. God help her. She wanted to see him break. Tony looked at the letter. He looked at Shepard. He looked at the 100+ bikers filling his diner, their faces impassive, their presence undeniable. He looked at Carmen, standing by the door with her arms wrapped around herself, and something in his expression shifted, not remorse exactly, but the recognition of a man who had been outmaneuvered. "Fine," he said. The word came out like it was being dragged over broken glass. "I'll sign it." Shepard produced a pen and held it out. Tony snatched it, scrawled his name across the bottom of the letter, and threw the pen on the counter. "There. Happy?" "Getting there." Shepard picked up the letter, examined the signature, and folded it carefully. He tucked it into his jacket and turned to Carmen. "Miss Reyes, your former employer has something he'd like to say to you." Carmen walked forward on legs that didn't feel like her own. She stopped a few feet from the wall, counter, close enough to see the sweat beading on Tony's forehead, the vein pulsing in his temple. "Well?" Shepard prompted. Tony's jaw clenched. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely audible, "for firing you. It was a mistake. And I'd like to offer you your job back, with a raise." Each word seemed to cost him something vital. "If you want it." Carmen looked at him, this man who had humiliated her, who had called her a thief in front of her coworkers, who had thrown her out like garbage because she dared to show compassion. She thought about the sleepless nights, the job applications, the fear that had wrapped around her chest and refused to let go. She thought about saying no, about telling him to take his job and his apology and shove them somewhere anatomically improbable. It would feel good, she knew. It would feel like justice. But then she thought about her mother and her father and Diego and the rent that was due in 10 days. She thought about the bills piled on the kitchen table and the savings account that was nearly empty and the reality that pride didn't pay for groceries. "I want it," she said, "but I have conditions." Tony's eyes narrowed. "Conditions?" "I want the raise in writing. I want a guarantee that I can't be fired without cause and documentation. And I want Kelsey to get a raise too. She's been working double shifts since you fired me, and she deserves better." Tony looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "Those are my conditions." Carmen's voice was steady now, stronger than it had been in days. "Take them or leave them." Shepard was smiling. It was a small smile, barely visible beneath his beard, but Carmen caught it. He nodded at her, once, a gesture of approval that warmed something in her chest. Tony looked at the bikers. He looked at Carmen. He looked at the letter in Shepard's jacket, the promise of consequences if he refused. "Fine," he said again. "Fine. You win." Carmen didn't feel like she'd won. She felt tired and relieved, and something else she couldn't quite name, a loosening of the knot that had lived in her stomach since Thursday afternoon. She nodded at Tony, not trusting herself to speak, and stepped back. Shepard clapped his hands together, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Excellent. Now that business is settled, let's eat." He turned to the room full of bikers. "All right, brothers, you heard the man. Full menu, full prices, and don't forget to tip your waitress." The diner erupted into motion. Orders were shouted, menus were grabbed. Conversations broke out in every corner. Eddie disappeared into the kitchen, his face a mask of bewildered determination. Kelsey scrambled to keep up, her order pad filling faster than she could write. Carmen stood in the middle of it all, watching the chaos unfold, trying to process what had just happened. A hand touched her shoulder, and she turned to find Shepard beside her. "You did good," he said quietly. "Standing up. For yourself. Asking for what you deserved. I didn't do anything. You did all of this. I showed up. You did the rest." He looked at her with those gray eyes, steady and kind. "That's how it works, Carmen. Kindness opens doors, but you still have to walk through them." He pressed something into her hand, a card, white with a phone number and a logo she didn't recognize, a horseman carrying a shepherd's crook. "If you ever need anything," he said, "anything at all, you call that number." Before she could respond, he was gone, moving through the crowd to settle into a booth near the window. Carmen looked down at the card in her hand, then at the diner full of bikers, then at Tony retreating to his office with his tail between his legs. She tucked the card into her pocket and went to find an apron. She had tables to serve. The lunch rush lasted 3 hours. Carmen had never worked a shift like it. Every table was full, every booth was packed, and the orders came so fast that Eddie had to call in his nephew to help in the kitchen. The bikers were polite, patient, and unfailingly generous. They said please and thank you. They didn't complain when the food took longer than usual, and they tipped like they were trying to make a point, which, Carmen realized, they probably were. By the time the last plate was cleared and the last check was paid, Carmen had made more in tips than she usually made in 2 weeks. Her feet ached, her back screamed, and her cheeks hurt from smiling, but she didn't care. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in months, maybe years, like something that had been sleeping inside her had finally woken up. The bikers left in waves, their engines roaring to life in the parking lot, their raised hands and nodded farewells a strange kind of benediction. Shepard was one of the last to go. He stopped at the register where Carmen was counting receipts and set a $100 bill on the counter. "That's too much," she said. "Your meal was $12. The rest is for the inconvenience." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "And for the show. I haven't seen a man that scared since '98. Carmen laughed before she could stop herself. "What happened in '98? "Long story. Involves a bull, a broken fence, and my ex-brother-in-law's prize-winning petunias." He shook his head. "Another time, maybe." He started toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Carmen, what you did on Thursday, feeding me when you knew you couldn't afford to, that wasn't just kindness. That was courage. The world doesn't reward that as often as it should, but today it did." He held her gaze. "Don't forget what that feels like, and don't let anyone make you believe it was wrong." He walked out into the afternoon sun, and a moment later she heard his motorcycle rumble to life and fade into the distance. Carmen stood at the register for a long time, the $100 bill in her hand, trying to find words for what she felt. She couldn't. Some things were too big for language. They just had to be lived. Tony emerged from his office around 4 o'clock after the last biker had gone, and the diner had returned to its usual quiet. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than he'd been before, like the confrontation had cost him something he couldn't get back. He didn't meet Carmen's eyes as he walked to the counter and poured himself a cup of coffee. "I meant what I said," he muttered. "About the job, the raise." "I know." Carmen kept her voice neutral. "I expect the paperwork by Monday." He nodded, still not looking at her. "I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "What I said on Thursday, about you stealing, that was—" He trailed off. "Wrong?" Carmen supplied. "Harsh." He took a sip of his coffee. "This is my father-in-law's business. He built it from nothing. I've been trying to keep it alive, and sometimes that means making hard decisions. I didn't think about—" Another pause. "I didn't think." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was more than Carmen had expected, and she found that her anger, which had burned so hot for 2 days, was starting to cool, not disappear. She didn't think it would ever fully disappear, but settle into something manageable, something she could carry without being consumed by it. "I'm not going to forget what happened," she said, "but I'm willing to move forward, if you are." Tony looked at her for the first time since Thursday. His eyes were tired, the eyes of a man who had been running on fear and pride for too long and had finally hit a wall. "I am," he said. They shook hands. It was awkward, formal, nothing like the easy rapport Carmen had with the regulars or the warmth she felt with Kelsey and Eddie. But it was a start, and sometimes a start was all you could ask for. The next few weeks passed in a blur of normalcy. Carmen worked her shifts, collected her tips, and adjusted to the strange new reality of being the waitress who had brought 100 bikers to the Golden Fork. The story had spread, of course. Nothing stayed secret in a small town, and she found herself fielding questions from customers, co-workers, even strangers on the street. She answered them as briefly as she could, deflecting the attention she didn't want, holding close the parts of the story that felt too personal to share. The raise came through as promised, an extra $2 an hour, plus a guarantee of 40 hours a week. Kelsey got her raise too, and Eddie was promoted to head cook with a corresponding bump in pay. Tony, for all his faults, kept his word. Carmen wasn't sure if it was honor or fear that motivated him, but she didn't particularly care. The result was the same. She called her mother on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after the incident, and told her everything. Rosa listened in silence, her breath catching only once, when Carmen described Shepard's army filing through the diner doors, and when Carmen finished, there was a long pause. "Mija," Rosa said finally, You did a good thing, a brave thing. I'm proud of you. I just gave a man some food, Mama. It wasn't that big a deal. It was a big deal to him, and it was a big deal to you, or you wouldn't have risked your job for it. Rosa's voice was firm. Don't diminish what you did. The world needs more people who help strangers, not fewer. You be proud of who you are. Carmen felt her eyes sting. I am, Mama. I'm trying to be. Good. Now come for dinner on Sunday. Your father wants to hear the story, and you know how he gets when he thinks he's missing out. Carmen laughed and promised she'd be there. She hung up and sat in the quiet of her apartment. She'd moved out of her parents' place the week before into a studio she could finally afford, and thought about everything that had happened. The rain, the stranger, the meal that had cost her everything and then given it back. The bikers who had shown up like an army of guardian angels demanding justice for a woman they'd never met. The card in her pocket that she still carried everywhere, a talisman against the uncertainty of the world. She pulled it out and looked at it. Iron Horseman MC. A phone number. A horseman carrying a shepherd's crook. She hadn't called the number. She didn't know if she ever would. But knowing it was there, knowing that somewhere out in the world there were people who would show up for her if she needed them, changed something fundamental in the way she moved through her days. She felt less alone, less afraid, more willing to take risks to help strangers, to believe that kindness wasn't just a weakness the world would punish. That was Shepard's gift, she realized. Not the confrontation with Tony, not the job or the raise or the $100 tip. It was the knowledge that she wasn't fighting alone, that there were others out there, strangers and friends alike, who believed in the same things she did and were willing to stand up for them. She tucked the card back into her pocket and went to get ready for work. The Golden Fork was waiting, and she had tables to serve. 2 years later, on a rainy Thursday afternoon that felt like an echo of another day, Carmen Reyes stood behind the counter of her own restaurant and watched the water stream down the windows. The place was called Second Chances. It was small, just 12 tables and a counter with 8 stools, but it was hers. Every tile, every light fixture, every coffee cup with the little logo she'd designed herself. She'd bought it 6 months ago, with savings, and a small business loan, and a larger loan from someone she'd never expected to hear from again. Shepard had called on a Tuesday, out of the blue, his voice the same low rumble she remembered from the Golden Fork. Heard you were looking to open your own place, he'd said. Need investors. She'd tried to refuse, had argued that she couldn't accept that kind of help, that she needed to do this on her own, that she didn't want charity. Shepard had listened patiently, and when she'd finished, he'd said, It's not charity, Carmen. It's an investment. You showed me who you are 2 years ago, when you risked everything to feed a stranger. That's the kind of person I want to bet on. She'd accepted the money, not because she needed it, though she did, but because refusing felt like rejecting everything Shepard and the Iron Horsemen stood for. They believed in her. The least she could do was believe in herself. The restaurant had opened in the spring, and by summer, it was turning a profit. Not a large one, not yet, but enough to pay the bills, to hire 2 full-time employees, to send a check to Shepard every month that he kept trying to return. The food was simple, burgers, sandwiches, homemade soup, but the portions were generous and the prices were fair, and word had spread that Second Chances was the kind of place where everyone was welcome, regardless of how much money they had in their pocket. That was the rule Carmen had established from the first day. No one left hungry. If someone couldn't pay, they ate anyway. If someone was down on their luck, they got a meal and a cup of coffee and the dignity of being treated like a human being. She'd started a tab for those meals, a running total she called the kindness account, and every month she was amazed by how many customers contributed to it without being asked. $5 here, $10 there, sometimes more. The account had never run dry. The bell above the door chimed, and Carmen looked up from the receipts she'd been sorting. A woman stood in the entrance, rain dripping from her coat, a look on her face that Carmen recognized instantly. Exhaustion, desperation, the particular kind of fear that comes from not knowing where your next meal will come from or where you'll sleep tonight. Carmen set down the receipts and walked around the counter. Come in, she said. Sit anywhere you like. The woman hesitated. I can't. You don't have to explain. Carmen guided her to a booth near the window, the same spot where she always seated people who looked like they needed a soft landing. Just sit. Warm up. I'll bring you some coffee. She went to the kitchen and made a plate, A burger, fries, a bowl of the chicken noodle soup she'd learned to make from her mother's recipe. She added a slice of pie, because the woman looked like she could use something sweet, and carried it all to the booth on a tray. The woman stared at the food like it might disappear if she blinked. "I told you I can't pay," she whispered. "I know." Carmen set the plate down and slid into the seat across from her. "This is on the house. No strings, no catch, just eat." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Carmen smiled. It was the same smile she'd given Shepard 2 years ago in a diner on a rainy afternoon, before everything changed. "Someone did it for me. Once," she said. "When I had nothing, when I was desperate, someone showed me kindness, and it changed my life. Now I try to do the same for others." She reached across the table and squeezed the woman's hand. "That's how it works. You pass it on. Someday, when you're in a position to help someone else, you will. And the chain keeps going." The woman picked up her fork with trembling hands and took a bite of the burger. Her eyes closed, and something in her face shifted, the tension loosening, the fear receding, just a little. Carmen left her to eat in peace. She went back to the counter and picked up her receipts, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the day Shepard had walked into the Golden Fork, soaked and exhausted and alone. She was thinking about the meal she'd given him, the job she'd lost, the army of bikers who had shown up to set things right. She was thinking about all the small moments of kindness that had led her here, to this place she'd built, to this life she'd never imagined. The bell chimed again, and she looked up. A man stood in the doorway, gray beard, slate-colored eyes, leather jacket dark with rain. He looked older than he had 2 years ago, more lines around his eyes, more silver in his hair, but his presence was the same, steady, certain, the kind of presence that filled a room without trying. Shepard. He walked to the counter and sat on one of the stools, exactly where he'd sat the first time they met. "Nice place," he said, looking around. "You've done good, Carmen." "I had help." She poured him a cup of coffee without asking. "What brings you here?" "Passing through. Thought I'd stop in, see how you were doing." He wrapped his hands around the mug, and she saw the years in his knuckles, the wear of the road in his skin. "Heard you've been taking care of people. Heard the kindness account is the worst-kept secret in town." Carmen shrugged. "Just trying to pay it forward. That's all any of us can do." Shepard took a sip of his coffee. "You remember what I told you, that day at the Golden Fork? About kindness opening doors?" "I remember. You walked through a lot of doors since then, built something real, something that matters." He set down the mug and looked at her, his gray eyes warm. "I'm proud of you, Carmen. Not many people take a second chance and turn it into something that gives other people second chances, too." Carmen felt her throat tighten. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Sure you could have. Would have taken longer, maybe. Would have been harder. But you would have done it." He smiled, and the hardness in his face softened. "That's who you are. That's who you've always been. I just helped you see it." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the rain streak down the windows. The woman in the booth had finished her meal and was sitting with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring out at the gray afternoon with an expression that was no longer desperate. It was something else now, something that looked like hope. "You staying for lunch?" Carmen asked. "Can't. Got a long ride ahead." Shepard stood and reached for his wallet, but Carmen held up a hand. "On the house, for old time's sake." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but next time I'm paying double." "Next time," Carmen agreed. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said. "The world needs more places like this, more people like you." He glanced at the woman in the booth, then back at Carmen. "Every meal you give away, every person you help, it matters. It all matters." "I know," Carmen said. "You taught me that." Shepard smiled one last time, pushed through the door, and disappeared into the rain. A moment later, she heard his motorcycle rumble to life, and then he was gone, the sound of his engine fading into the gray, until there was nothing left but the patter of rain on glass. Carmen stood at the counter, looking out at the empty parking space where his bike had been. The woman from the booth appeared beside her, her empty plate in her hands. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was stronger now, steadier. "I don't know how to repay you." Carmen took the plate and smiled. "You don't repay me," she said. "You pass it on. That's the deal. Someday, when you're back on your feet, you help someone else. And they help someone else, and it keeps going, on, until the world's a little bit better than it was before." The woman nodded slowly, like she was hearing something she needed to hear. "I will," she said. "I promise." She walked out into the rain, and Carmen watched her go. Then she turned back to the counter, picked up a rag, and started wiping down the surface. There would be more customers soon, the dinner crowd, the regulars, the strangers passing through who needed a warm meal and a kind word. There would be more chances to help, more doors to open, more moments of grace that rippled outward in ways she would never see. That was the lesson Shepard had taught her, the lesson she tried to live every day. Kindness wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a favor to be repaid or a debt to be settled. It was a seed, planted in the soil of the world, growing in directions you couldn't predict, blooming in places you'd never visit. All you had to do was plant it. Carmen looked around her restaurant, the tables she'd chosen, the walls she'd painted, the sign above the door that said second chances, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. This was her life now. This was her purpose. And it had all started with a meal she couldn't afford to give, given anyway, on a rainy Thursday afternoon to a stranger who turned out to be family. The bell above the door chimed. Carmen looked up, ready to greet whoever walked in, ready to plant another seed, ready to pass it on.